So, hello everyone. The first thing that I would like to say is thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being there online. It's the first offline event that I'm since before COVID, and it's really good to be again with other developers to speak about the things that we love and not to be just at home. So, for everyone that came, thank you. Everyone online, thank you, and I hope that you're having a fantastic time. My name is Gonc. Palma. I'm a GD for Flutter, and I do several things for some companies. And today, we are going to see how we can add Flutter to existing native apps. Or, as I put there, how to be sneaky and add Flutter to existing apps without saying to your clients or PM. And why is this important? Well, imagine that you are working for not a startup, but for Uber, for example. And you say, well, there's a really great technology called Flutter that I would really like to put in our project because I'm really good at it or I really enjoy it. And they'll say, yeah, well, but the cost of doing that, of redoing thousands or sometimes hundreds of thousands of lines of code, it's too expensive for us. And Flutter around, I think it was in Flutter 1.12, so around 2019, they did one thing called add to app. And before going into why we should use it, I prefer to start with what is it? And add to app is basically a way, again, for us to add existing Flutter code to existing Android and iOS apps. And the special thing here is that since we are on mobile, maybe you can add it to, I don't know, but maybe you can add it to a Cordova app, or to a React Native app, or even to a native Android or iOS application. And I'm just going to go here because it's easier for me to read. And the same way that we use platform channels in plugins, we are using the same thing in add to app. So basically, if you already use platform channels, you know that we have some Flutter code. Then we use the platform channel in order to communicate both with native Android and with native iOS. Just a little bit of a refresher of what is a platform channel. So platform channels basically work with messages. So we have a host, which can be the native Android or iOS application. We open a channel. We can call it, for example, a switch channel for our Sweetly application that we'll see in a bit. And our channel will be able to communicate message between the two. And the good thing is that we cannot only have one channel. We give it a name, it's going to be a unique identifier. So that means that we can have Flutter code and Flutter plugins. Because, for example, maybe you have a Google Maps, maybe you are using Bluetooth or some other thing, and you want also to add Flutter to your existing apps. No problem. Use a unique identifier, and that's it. So all the messages, and this is just for someone in native Android, all the message should be processed in the main thread of the application so that you can use it effectively. And you'll see it a little bit later. I will try to have some code on the screen, but just so that you know, you are going to transfer data from one side to another as a map of string dynamic. Now, the big question is, why should I care about this? As I said at the start, if we try to convince either our clients, our PMs, or someone else that let's redo everything in Flutter, it's going to be impossible. It's going to take a lot of time, and it's hard to convince anyone to have that cost of both time and also monetary. And we can use it in a sneaky way. Let's say we have Uber. Again, for example, and I'm not sponsored by Uber. I would love to, but no. And let's say that they want to add a new screen in which you can lend your backpack to anyone, be it. Well, instead of just doing it in native Android and native iOS, what we can do is we develop this new feature in Flutter, and then it will be used both in Android and iOS. Or maybe there's a single screen that's always crashing and that the users don't like, and maybe needs a little bit of refresher of the UI, of the code, everything else. Well, we can extract that screen from the native platforms and then use it and create it using Flutter. And the good thing, or the great thing about this, is that not all developers need to know about Flutter. So you don't need to fire everyone from your native team and say, let's just hire Flutter developers. No. We can have a core Flutter developer team that will work only on the refactors and on the new code, and then you have your native team. So everyone is going to be happy about it, because they can both coexist. So you don't have to convince both your tech lead and your PMs and clients. And if you already know Flutter, then you know why you should try to use Add to App or anything else to use Flutter. Well, we will only have one code base. If we have one code base, it's going to be easier to develop, easier to test, and it's going to be faster for us to deliver it to the client. So in a brief summary, Add to App for us, it's going to be a solution to convince existing companies to have Flutter in their apps. And now imagine not only the present, but the future. We said that, okay, I'm going to create a backpack screen. If in the future your company says, Flutter is great, I want to redo all my application in Flutter, you already have part of the code done. So you only have to integrate what you did in Flutter into the new Flutter application that you're doing. So if you manage to convince your management, the clients, etc., to move everything to Flutter, then part of the work is already done, which is quite cool. Now, what's the current state of Add to App? And here, current state might be a little bit misleading, because again, this has been ongoing since Flutter 1.16, I think. And we are going to focus only on Android on this talk, not on iOS. I have a little bit of background in Android. So we can add Flutter UI to existing applications via the form of a standalone activity, a fragment, and a view. And the good thing is that we can also use Flutter plugins inside our Add to App view. So if I need to open a new URL, if I need to use the camera, then I can use it inside Flutter on the host or on the native application. So we can use Flutter as we did, because as we saw on the start, it's just another platform channel. We create another platform channel for the plugins, and that's it. And also we can use, of course, Firebase and all the good stuff that we'd love. It's also possible to convert everything into a new module. In the case of Android, it's going to be .aar. And why is this good? Well, because your other developers don't need to install Flutter into your application. So again, if we have that scenario in which we have native people that say, oh, why dislike hybrid frameworks? That's not for me. I just like the good stuff of native platforms. Well, they don't need to install Flutter. Why? Maybe you host your AAR file in a GitHub repo or somewhere along the CI/CD pipeline, and every time that it's updated, they get a new file, and then it's just like in any other old library in Android. You implement the file already has the Flutter framework, it has your Flutter code, and it will run it. You can see the current documentation in the official Flutter websites. And although it's not here, I did this talk 2 years ago when Add to App was just starting, and just mentioning on a historic note that before Add to App was a thing, Alibaba did, I think it was Flutter Boost, which was another way of adding Flutter to existing applications, but this time thinking not as views, but as a web view, if I remember correctly. So just to say that if you don't like this approach, you can try other approach into adding Flutter to your existing native applications. So let's go with a practical example. And I wanted to create an app in which you can select different suites. As you can see here on the GIF, basically you have a login screen. Then you have a screen where you can select a type of suite, and then you'll have a detail. And the curious thing about this is that the project was divided in an unconventional way, because the login screen and the detail screen are done in native Android, but then the list of pastries are going to be made in Flutter. And this introduces a very nice challenge, because not only are we presenting a view, which is going to be the list of sweets, but we will also need to communicate to Android saying this is exactly the sweet that I chose to present the detail. And in this case, we are going to develop our entire screen as a standalone activity, because again, it's a separate screen. It's not a fragment inside the other screen. What are the requirements? If you are on a very, very old Android project, one thing that you need to bear in mind is that in your build.gradle, you need to add the source compatibility and the target compatibility to 1.8 in order for you to use add to app, because of all the modules that Flutter creates on their site. Now, how can we start doing this? The process is quite simple. Well, the process is that you can either use your IDE or you can use the command line. Why use the command line and not the IDE? That would be a whole another talk, but this command will be the same in IntelliJ, will be the same in VS Code, will be the same in Vim, whatever you will use. Sometimes English is hard. And you can enable this by doing Flutter, create -t module, put your organization, so whatever is going to be in your build.gradle, and then put the name of your module. It will create a new Flutter module, which has the app and identifier that we've put there, and it's going to be created in the Sweetly Flutter folder, and it will contain several files that will host your Flutter code. So as we know, the Flutter code will also have a .android and a .ios folder in case we need inside our Flutter view to communicate with the native platforms. And also we have the folders that we love, lib folder and our pubspec.yaml file. Now that we have our module created, we can go ahead and bind the Flutter module to, oh, great animations, Gonçalo, to our application. And there are different ways that we can add our module to the application, and it depends on the specificities of our team. As I said in the start, we need to see, okay, am I going to have a native team that doesn't care about Flutter and I want to integrate Flutter, or do I have a team of curious people that maybe want to try out Flutter and want to try something? The first way we are going to compile that .arr file that we are going to send the developers so that they don't have to even touch Flutter. The second way, well, if they have Flutter installed on their machines, then they can compile the code. Of course, the second way is going to be sometimes better because it's just pulling the code, the refresh code. You don't have to wait for a new binary to be compiled, and voila, you have the whole application for yourself. You can make some quick changes, etc., etc. But the first thing that we need to do before all that is let's do a good old Flutter pub get. If we did this from our IDE, of course, IntelliJ or VS Code would do it for us, but just to be sure, let's do it. Now, let's bind our project by changing in our host application the settings.gradle file. So as you see here, these are lines that are copied directly from the instruction manual. It's not something esoteric. So just to include the application, set the binding, and then evaluate the new file, which is going to be exactly the folder in which you have hosted the module that we just created. Now, I have created the module, so now we can move on to show our Flutter screen. Again, if we are in Android, and I'm sorry, Jetpack people, if this has changed, I don't know Android Jetpack, I don't know Jetpack Compose, but in the good old days, you added each activity to the Android manifest. So you needed to add something new just to say, oh, I'm going to have a new screen. And in this case, what we do need is to have a new activity inside the application with that specific name. So it's going to be Flutter embedding Android and Flutter activity. Again, if we had maybe a specific view or if we had a fragment, what we would put here is different. And then we need to put a lot of configuration changes because, again, Flutter is going to handle if a keyboard is shown on the screen, if you resize your screen, if you rotate your phone, etc., etc. And finally, the hardware acceleration, window soft input, and the exported equals to true. These are all things that are in the documentation. So again, we could just copy them, tinker it if you like, and use away in our application. Now, we need to, inside our, in this case, Kotlin, not Java code, we need to extend our app compact activity. And we need to, in the first screen, in this case, the login screen, we create a new intent with the Flutter activity.create default intent of this. This is a helper function that we already have, and this function will allow us to transition directly to the screen that we created. And how can now we add new content to our Flutter screen? And I added this slide because I don't know your current level of expertise with Flutter. Maybe you're someone new joining in Flutter, or maybe you're an expert. If you're an expert, I'm terribly sorry. This is going to be just the basics of Flutter. But from someone who's interested in Android or who is heavily invested in Android and wants to shift to Flutter, this part of the presentation is just to show some of the nice details. Thank you. Perfect. So we can move on. As I was saying, basically, this is going to be a small introduction into Flutter and how we can compare it to what we have in Android. So again, if you know Flutter, I'm terribly sorry for that. The first thing is that in Flutter, you can say with me, everything is a widget. Thank you so much. Perfect. So at the top, we'll have our app bar widget, and on our app bar widget, we can display then I put it on the next slide. And then we have our list view widget. The list view, for those who are in Android, is going to be, I think, our recycler view. Again, not for Jetpack Compose, for old Android. And it behaves somewhat the same way. So if you have a list with 1,000 files, it's not going to hold the 1,000 files in memory. As you scroll, it's going to recycle and create new files as they are popping up on the screen. Then we have card elements, and card elements actually do quite a few things. So they add the background, which is white, as you can see there. They add a specific border and then a shadow. So quite a lot of things. And then again, inside it, you can put child or children widgets inside it. Now, as you know, in Flutter, we can put our widgets either horizontally or vertically. Since in this case they are horizontally, we have first a row, and then we have a column just to display the 2 lines of text there. Did someone say text? I hope it's the next slide, else it will be, no, it will be the new one. Then I remember, again, in old Android, I needed to import, I think it was Picasso. Yes, I need to import a new library in order just to show a network image. Well, the good thing about Flutter is we already have a widget for that. So most of the things that we didn't took for granted in Flutter, we have them. And that's why I think it's good because, again, it's out of the box. You can do image.network for network images and image.asset, I think, for asset images. So we have a lot of things that we can use with image. And then, finally, then we have our text widgets. Everything that is text in Flutter, we can use a text widget to display in it. And then you say, OK, but that text that we have over there is quite simple. Either it's all bold or it's the same size. So how can we do some dynamic text? Well, we have rich text. With rich text, you can put text with different styles, and we can also put some behavior on it. One of the behaviors can be, for example, imagine for the first one, pastel nata. The nata could be in blue, and when clicking on it, it will be a hyperlink to some website, for example. So that's something that we can do with rich text. And finally, if we want to add, since we are using material like our good friend Carlo did in the last talk, in the first talk, in fact, then we can use the inkwell widget, which will add both a callback and a ripple effect when the user clicks on the card. And there would be quite a lot of things that we can talk about this code. This is a lot of code here, but I want us just to focus on this. This code here, we have list view, we have suites, map, and toList. This is the code that we are using to display the whole list of items. And for me, at the time, this was magical because, oh my God, we have a list of data models that we are going just to use a map function, and now they're widgets. So we don't have to do any adapter, we don't have to do anything else like we did in the good old Android days. It's just mapping to list, put it inside the widget, and then Flutter will take care of everything else. Then, again, here, a huge block of code. It's horrible for presentations to do this, but I want to highlight two things. The first one is this, the SweetClick click listener. SweetClick, it's a type that I created with something called typeDef. And I wanted to highlight this because with Flutter, with widgets, we can pass functions inside our widgets. So in this way, again, we talked in the inkwell widget, we had a callback. Well, this callback could be this function. So every time that the user clicks on the screen, they will have a function that accepts, for example, a sweet item and returns something else. So that's something also quite cool that we have in Flutter. And finally, again, just an emphasis on the image.network because, again, I think that it's magical. It's pretty bland for everyone who is in Flutter for quite a long time, but come on, it's cool. Now, we've added our new widgets on the screen, and now hopefully we can show the user everything. They see the list of items, they see the app bar, etc., etc. But there's an inconvenience that unfortunately I think that I'm going to show you at the last slide, which is if you've worked in Flutter long enough, you know that when you start the application, you'll have just a couple of few seconds in which the screen is white. I call that, or at least before it was called that, warming up the Flutter engine. So Flutter is calling all the binaries, it's calling the frameworks, we're calling everything else in order to get our app up and running. We can hide that behavior in our Flutter-only applications by adding a splash screen, but what can we do if we don't control the splash screen of the application because it's native, and we just want to do a seamless transition from one place to another? The answer is creating a warmed up Flutter engine. How can we do it? Well, again, this is a little bit of a recipe that we are going to follow. We need to extend the application class in Kotlin. We need to create a new constant, which is going to be, well, you can or cannot, but it's better to create a constant, which is going to be the engine ID. And then you create a new Flutter engine for that application, and you put there a Dart executor to execute a certain entry point. And again, if we want to do everything by default, as you see, I'm using just default functions. And finally, I put it in a cache. So in a very succinct way, what we have here is I'm creating a new Flutter engine and I'm putting it in the cache so that in the future I can use it. And since we are using that Flutter engine in my application, what is going to happen is that this engine is going to be warming up right up till the point that we show the Flutter screen. So while the user is still in the login screen, Flutter will be on the background trying to warm up everything. How can we use it? Well, instead of using the default code that we have in the Flutter activities, so as you saw previously, we had the create default intent to go to our Flutter activity. In this case, we are going to create a new activity that extends Flutter activity, and that has the provide Flutter engine, and what we provide, well, the cached engine that we created before. And then, of course, we must also update the Android manifest file, and you can see here the differences. On the left, we don't have a warmed up engine, and it can take quite a while. Again, this was done a while ago. In the meantime, Flutter has improved a lot of things, but it's good for us to see the difference. There's still some white screen on the right because we see a slight transition, but this is something that maybe we can fine tune. But having to have what we have on the left, it seems like we are opening a website. We are opening something until we have something on the screen, and that can be a bad user experience. So with warming up, with creating a cached engine, we can fix this problem. Now, again, navigation, like Carlo did. We need to navigate from one screen to another. We saw just a little bit about that we use either the default intent or we create our own Flutter activity and we go to that page. But what happens if we click back on our phone? What happens if we have a button called close and we want to go from the Flutter activity to the native activity? Well, the good news, again, Flutter is amazing, yay, is that the back arrow on the up bar and the navigation buttons on bottom of Android, and I think also the slide back button on iOS, it's already handled by Flutter and the Flutter activity. In the off chance that you really have something that is like close button and this needs to go back to the native application, then you can use the Dart or the Flutter function, systemnavigator.pop. It will pop the current instance and voila, you're back again at the native application. And finally, sometimes because of the light it's hard for me to see. We use for any other type of navigation, we need to use the Flutter Suite activity to the native host of our Flutter code to handle it. Thank you, Gonc, for helping me in that. So basically, again, mostly everything is handled by Flutter, but if needed, we can fine-tune it with System Navigator Pop and other cool functions. Now, if we need to communicate, and if we need to communicate this type of navigation between Flutter and the native platform, how are we going to do? Well, going back, we have to use platform channels in order to do that. So the first thing that we do is we are going to register a channel, and then we are going to say to that channel, what is the method that I'm going to invoke? In the case here, I create a new channel, which is going to be the com.vanetos.sweetly/Flutter, and then I invoke a method called goToDetail. What does this do? Well, this will basically tell my Flutter codes, hey, in the channel, I'm listening to it. In that specific channel, I have a goToDetail call that I will need to handle it. And the way that we can do it, or even before handling it in Flutter, we have here just a slight problem, which is we said that our navigation is going to be clicking on an item, and then we need to pass that information into Flutter in order to display the, we have in Flutter, we need to display a list of elements in Flutter, we click on them, and then we have our native screen. So we need to find some way that we are going to have this kind of navigation. Because again, recapping, we have our native screen. Our native screen creates an intent either for the default activity or for the activity that we extended with the cached engine. But then Flutter needs to communicate again with the native platform saying, hey, the user has selected something, so please show me a new screen in the native application. And that is why, again, we use the new method channel, and then we set a new method handler. The set method handler is basically saying, okay, did I receive a message called goToDetail? If yes, then you can start this specific activity with that specific intent. Now, how can we send data to the native app? We saw up until this point, okay, I'm in the native application and I'm going to receive something so that I can create a new intent to go to the new screen, but how can I send it from the Flutter side? Again, we are going to use platform channels, and the way that platform channels work, then again, is just a map. We are just sending data to it. So I'm just going to say, for this specific channel with this ID, I call this function in the evoke method, so I call the goToDetail, and I will send this specific map into the native application. I pass in the name, I pass in the country and the image. And then, if you remember, here in our handler method, we could do some magic. We could retrieve all those arguments, and then we could create the intent. So just going back and forth, which is exactly what we do here. So before we were only handling the intent, going to a new activity, but remember we need to have the detail, the specific item that we are going to use, so we can get the call.argument string, so everything from that map that we pass from Flutter to the native application, and we can put everything in our intent to display the new activity. And now, all of this was very good. So what did we manage to accomplish so far? So far, we managed to have an application that was native, written in Android, old Android, not the good hip one. And then we had to integrate a Flutter screen into that application. That Flutter screen communicated back and forth some few messages, but there are still a lot of things that we can do. One of the things that I suggest doing is, again, in order to use it right now, everyone in our team needed to have Flutter installed in their machines. So the next step, obviously for me, would be to go into the guides and see how can I compile this Flutter code into an AIR file, send it to someone that only has Android in their system so that they can use it. The next thing is, well, we are in Flutter, so let's use the awesome features of Flutter. In good old Android days, if I needed to see something refresh on the screen, I needed to relaunch the whole application, basically. Well, if we are in Flutter, if we are in the Flutter screen, just use hot reload. If you are in the terminal, click R. If you are in the IDE, use whatever you use in the IDE for that. And how can we use the terminal? Well, we can go into the specific directory so that we have the pubspec.yaml and the lib folder, and then we use flutter attach. Flutter attach will wait until the Flutter screen is on, and then it will start listening for new events, so logs, etc., etc. And finally, I hope it's finally, we need to find other uses to why we should use it. One of the things is, well, let's not only create Android and iOS screens. One of the things that I tried to do, I did it in iOS, but I failed to do in Android, is let's go the extra level. We are a services company in Flutter. We develop a library, for example. Well, we don't need to do that whole library in Kotlin and Swift. What we can do is we develop our code as a library in Flutter, and then we do some magic, or giga-joga as we say in Portuguese, in order for it to be a native library that we can use in our applications. And this is very powerful because any application from React Native to Cordova to Ionic to whatever could then use a Flutter module inside it for authentication, for taking pictures, for whatever you want. And again, it's just to get our hands dirty and trying to do exactly the same thing for iOS. It's going to be fairly simple, so we already have the Flutter code. The only thing that we need to do is let's go back a few slides. Let's click on that URL and let's just see how we can also create the module for iOS and go away with it. Voila! With this presentation, we now have Flutter code inside our native applications. Here, I'm going to share the slides with everyone, and we'll find a way to do it. Here at the end, you have the GitHub repo with the project, and I hope that you liked the talk. Thank you. This is going to be my blog, and if in the future, right now I'm fully booked. In the future, if you want to have Flutter lessons, then you can go here, and we'll have a chat about it. Thank you so much. Thank you for all your time, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.